a degenerate prince, condemned by the imperial court as a public disgrace, a notorious playboy whose naked archduke scandal shamed an empire and who rotted away in a villa from syphilis. And yet, he was the father of a man so holy, so pious, that the Catholic Church would one day beatify him as Blessed Karl, the last emperor of Austria. His name was Archduke Otto. How did a life of such profound decadent sin give rise to a legacy of such sacred, tragic devotion? That rebellion was inevitable. Otto was a man crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled: the world he was born into and the world he would ultimately defy. On November 21st, 1865, as Otto Franz Joseph Karl Ludwig Maria of Austria, he arrived not just into a family, but into a living, breathing institution, the House of Habsburg. For over 6 centuries, this lineage had dominated European politics, their influence shaping kingdoms and continents. At the head of this colossal empire was his uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph I, a figure of almost mythical stoicism. Franz Joseph, by this point, was a man hardened by personal tragedies: the execution of his brother Maximilian in Mexico, the scandalous suicide of his only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, and the distant, enigmatic presence of his beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, who famously abhorred court life. He was a monarch who embodied duty, tradition, and an almost anachronistic adherence to protocol in an era hurtling towards modernity. Otto's parents were Archduke Karl Ludwig, Franz Joseph's younger brother, and Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon Two Sicilies. Karl Ludwig was a devout and somewhat humorless man, deeply committed to his faith and his role within the imperial family. Maria Annunziata, Otto's mother, was a delicate, often sickly woman who passed away when Otto was just 7 years old. This early loss, while a personal tragedy, meant that Otto's primary upbringing fell even more squarely under the strictures of the imperial court and the pervasive influence of his pious father. The atmosphere was one of unyielding discipline, constant religious observance, and an absolute adherence to the myriad rules of Habsburg etiquette. Children were expected to be seen, rarely heard, and certainly never to express personal desires that deviated from dynastic expectations. The Habsburg court was not just a residence, it was a universe unto itself, a gilded cage designed to preserve an ancient lineage in its power. Life within its walls was a meticulously choreographed dance of ceremony, prayer, and political maneuvering. Every morning began with Mass, every meal was a formal affair, and every public appearance was a performance of imperial grandeur. For a young archduke, education was rigorous, focusing on languages, history, military strategy, and the unwavering tenets of the Catholic Church. There was little room for personal expression, for spontaneity, or for anything that hinted at individuality. This was the crucible in which Otto was forged, and it was perhaps this very rigidity that sparked the fires of his eventual rebellion. Otto was born relatively far down the line of succession. While still a Grand Archduke, he wasn't destined for the throne itself. His uncle, Franz Joseph, had his direct heir, Crown Prince Rudolph, a brooding, intellectual, and equally rebellious figure in his own right. Then came Otto's father, Karl Ludwig, and then his elder brother, Franz Ferdinand. This seemingly comfortable distance from the ultimate responsibility of emperorship might have offered Otto a unique kind of freedom, a space where he could breathe slightly more easily than his more burdened relatives. He was, in a sense, a spare, less scrutinized, at least initially. However, fate, as it often does in royal narratives, had a cruel twist in store. In 1889, the empire was rocked by the shocking news from Merling, a hunting lodge where Crown Prince Rudolph and his mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead in a suspected murder-suicide pact. This tragedy sent shockwaves across Europe and irrevocably altered the Habsburg line of succession. Suddenly, Franz Joseph was without a direct heir. The mantle fell to his brother, Karl Ludwig, and upon his death in 1896, it passed to Otto's elder brother, Franz Ferdinand. This elevation of Franz Ferdinand to heir apparent thrust Otto, as the next most prominent male heir, into a more visible and scrutinized position within the imperial hierarchy. The relative obscurity he once enjoyed vanished, replaced by an intense glare from court, press, and public alike. This sudden shift in his position, coupled with the profound strictures of his upbringing, seemed to intensify Otto's innate rebellious streak. Vienna itself, the glittering capital of the empire, became both his playground and his battleground. Beneath the veneer of imperial grandeur and aristocratic decorum, Vienna was a city of vibrant contradictions. It was a cradle of artistic innovation, psychoanalysis, and intellectual ferment, but also a den of hidden pleasures, clandestine affairs, and bohemian liberation. The rigid formality of the Hofburg stood in stark contrast to the burgeoning coffeehouse culture, the scandalous cabarets, and the bustling, anonymous streets where one could escape the prying eyes of society. It was into this simmering cauldron of tradition and modernity, duty and desire, that Archduke Otto plunged head first. He was a young man of considerable charm, an undeniable charisma that drew people to him, a natural elegance that was both innate and honed by his royal bearing. But crucially, he possessed a spirit that refused to be tamed. He chafed under the suffocating weight of court expectations, seeing perhaps the hypocrisy and the hollow rituals that underpinned the grand facade. He sought out life raw and unfiltered, in direct opposition to the rarefied, often suffocating air of the palace. His transformation from a young, well-born archduke into the infamous Playboy prince was not an overnight metamorphosis, but a gradual, defiant unfolding, nurtured by his temperament and the unique, contrasting environment of fin de siècle Vienna. He was determined to live life on his own terms, no matter the cost, no matter the scandal. To truly grasp the world Otto sought to defy, we must understand its almost surreal place in time. The year Otto was born, 1865, was a watershed moment for the modern world. Across the Atlantic, the guns of the American Civil War finally fell silent, and President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. A new, industrial, democratic-leaning world was being forged in blood and fire. But in Vienna, the Habsburgs were attempting to govern an empire of staggering complexity, not with new ideas, but with rituals and protocols that felt closer to the 1600s. It was a magnificent, gilded anachronism. Otto wasn't just rebelling against his father, he was rebelling against time itself. And so, Otto made his choice. He turned his back on the cold, echoing halls of the Hofburg Palace and dove headfirst into the warm, intoxicating embrace of Vienna's nightlife. He wasn't just a participant. He became its royal icon. The city's wags and gossip columnists, in a flurry of whispered awe and aristocratic disdain, soon gave him a title that would stick for life: the Habsburg Don Juan. It was a name spoken with a mix of envy, disgust, and undeniable fascination. His life became a blur of champagne-fueled nights. He rarely attended the staid high society balls expected of his rank, and when he did, he left early. His true court was found in the smoky, velvet-draped cabarets, where satirical performers openly mocked the aristocracy, though perhaps not him to his face. He was a familiar figure, in the city's most luxurious and notorious brothels, establishments that catered to a wealthy clientele desperate to escape the constraints of their public lives. He held court in the green rooms of theaters, not as a patron of the high arts, but as an admirer of the actresses and dancers, women whose profession was considered barely respectable, let alone suitable company for an archduke. Now, royal indiscretions were nothing new. Kings and princes had kept mistresses for centuries. But there was a crucial difference with Otto. The Habsburg Code, dictated by Emperor Franz Joseph, was one of absolute discretion. A slip-up was a sin, but a public slip-up was an unforgivable crime against the dynasty. The emperor's own son, Crown Prince Rudolf, had been radical, intellectual, and self-destructive, but he had largely kept his affairs hidden until the final catastrophic explosion at Mayerling. Otto, it seemed, couldn't care less about discretion. He didn't just have affairs, he flaunted them. He paraded his mistresses, actresses, singers, society butterflies, in public, taking them to fashionable restaurants, driving them through the Prater Park in his carriage for all of Vienna to see. This wasn't just a young man sowing his wild oats. This was a deliberate public performance of defiance. It was a shocking rejection of the Habsburgs' carefully cultivated, almost sacred image of Catholic piety and conservative dignity. Each public appearance with an unsuitable woman was a slap in the face to his uncle, the emperor, and a source of deep, unending gossip for the elite. This flagrant disregard for propriety naturally led to a series of escalating scandals, each one more shocking than the last, that cemented his reputation as the empire's ultimate black sheep. One of the most talked about and prolonged of these was his affair with a Viennese actress, an operetta singer named Louise Robinson. In the rigid social hierarchy of Vienna, actresses were seen as little more than high-class courtesans. They were beautiful, talented, and available, but they were utterly outside the bounds of respectable society. Otto's liaison with Louise wasn't a fleeting one-night affair. It was a passionate, public, and long-running relationship that electrified the city's gossip mills. They were seen together constantly. He reportedly showered her with gifts, paid her rent, and installed her in a lavish apartment. For the press, it was a gold mine. While respectful papers hinted delicately at the Archduke's theatrical interests, the more sensational scandal-hungry publications ran thinly veiled stories about the Archduke Otto and his beautiful muse. It was an open secret and a running joke in the cabarets he frequented. For the Imperial family, it was a nightmare. This wasn't just a personal failing, it was a political liability. Emperor Franz Joseph was famously involved in his own discreet friendship with an actress, Katharina Schratt, but that relationship was carefully managed, almost sanctioned, as a private companionship for the lonely monarch. Otto's affair was the opposite. It was messy, loud, and disrespectful. It strained his relationship with his family to the breaking point, and it confirmed every dark suspicion the conservative court held about his character. He was seen as decadent, unreliable, and hopelessly indiscreet. But as shocking as the Louise Robinson affair was, it would be utterly eclipsed by an incident so bizarre, so appallingly public, that it has become the defining legend of Otto's life. It is a story that even today seems almost too theatrical to be true. The event is often referred to as the Naked Archduke incident. The setting was the legendary Hotel Sacher, the very epicenter of Viennese high society. It was a place of quiet luxury, whispered conversations, and impeccable decorum, frequented by the highest echelons of the aristocracy. One evening, so the story goes, a group of foreign dignitaries and their wives were gathered in the hotel's opulent lobby, or perhaps one of its private dining salons. Suddenly a commotion erupted. Archduke Otto, in an advanced state of intoxication, stumbled into the public space. This alone would have been a scandal, but it was his attire, or lack thereof, that stopped every heart in the room. Accounts vary slightly, as they always do with such legends. Some claim he was wearing nothing at all. Others, perhaps more plausibly, state he was wearing only his sword belt and saber, or perhaps a pair of boots. The most popular version of the tale has him appearing in a state of near total undress, his modesty barely preserved by an opera cloak he had haphazardly thrown over his shoulders. He was by all accounts roaring drunk, perhaps having been engaged in a private party upstairs that had gone wildly out of control. The reaction was instantaneous horror. Ladies averted their eyes. Men were frozen in disbelief. Here was a Habsburg Archduke, second in line to the imperial throne after his brother, behaving not just like a common drunkard, but in a way that defied all comprehension of public decency. It was a grotesque parody of his station. The hotel staff, frantic, rushed to cover him and escort him from the premises, but the damage was done. The story was too good, too shocking to be contained. Within days, it was the scandal of the decade. It ripped through Vienna, then across Europe. It was whispered in every drawing room, every coffee house, every diplomatic pouch. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of Otto's degeneracy. For Emperor Franz Joseph, this was the deepest humiliation. It was a direct assault on the dignity of the crown, an insult to the family name, and a confirmation that his nephew was a lost cause. The naked Archduke incident was no longer just the behavior of a playboy. It was an act of treason against the imperial image. Why? Why would a man of such privilege, so close to the pinnacle of power, behave in such a self-destructive, almost nihilistic way? Was it simply a taste for debauchery, or was something deeper at play? It's impossible to know his mind, but it's easy to speculate. Perhaps this was the only way he knew how to feel alive, the only way to exert control in a life where every major decision was made for him. By becoming the Habsburg Don Juan, by orchestrating the naked Archduke incident, he was, in a twisted way, the author of his own story. He was rejecting the suffocating, perfect image the court demanded and replacing it with a scandalous but undeniably human, one of his own making. It was a desperate, drunken, and deeply tragic scream for individuality. This rebellion, however, came with a very real and very steep price tag. Otto's lifestyle was, in a word, ruinous. The champagne, the parties, the high-stakes gambling in exclusive clubs, the lavish apartments and expensive jewels showered upon his mistresses like Louise Robinson. It all cost a fortune. And it was a fortune that Otto, for all his status, did not personally control. His income was an allowance from the imperial family, an allowance he burned through with astonishing speed. He began to accumulate staggering debts. He borrowed from friends, from acquaintances, and, most dangerously, from moneylenders, who were all too happy to have an archduke in their ledgers. This financial extravagance was yet another profound source of shame for the family. Habsburgs were supposed to be above such grubby things as debt. They were the patrons, the lenders, the absolute authority. To have an archduke begging for loans was an inversion of the natural order. Time and time again, the situation would become untenable. His creditors would threaten public action. Again and again, a furious Emperor Franz Joseph was forced to intervene. The emperor, a man of frugal, almost Spartan personal habits, would reluctantly order the imperial treasury to pay off his nephew's massive debts. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was a cold, pragmatic transaction, It was blackmail. Otto knew that the emperor would pay, not to save him, but to save the name. The emperor would pay to prevent the public scandal of an archduke being sued for non-payment, to silence the moneylenders, and to sweep the whole sordid affair back under the imperial rug. Each payment was a reinforcement of Otto's power over the family he shamed, and a deepening of the emperor's contempt for him. And as if the public scandals and financial black holes weren't enough, there were the whispers, persistent, unprovable rumors of illegitimate children. In a city as small and insular as aristocratic Vienna, such speculation was inevitable. Did he father children out of wedlock with his many mistresses? While no definitive proof exists in primary sources, no acknowledged bastard children have ever come to light. The rumor was damage enough. It painted him as irresponsibly prolific, a man spreading his tainted blood outside the sacred confines of dynastic marriage. It added another layer of sordidness to his legend, another cross for the imperial family to bear. Otto had firmly established his reputation. He was the Playboy prince, the Habsburg Don Juan, the naked archduke. He was a financial drain, a public relations disaster, and a constant throbbing source of shame for the emperor. His repeated clashes with the imperial court, his endless cycle of scandal, reprimand, debt, and bailout had alienated him from his family. But the dynasty was not done with him. He still had one crucial, non-negotiable duty to perform. He had to marry, and the wife chosen for him would be a woman whose character was the absolute antithesis of his own. Join us next time as we explore the tragic, complex marriage of Archduke Otto and Princess Maria Josepha, a union of opposites that would produce an heir destined to rule, even as Otto himself spiraled further into the darkness that would ultimately consume him. By now, Archduke Otto had cemented his reputation as the Habsburg Don Juan. He was a man defined by public scandal, from the infamous naked archduke incident at the Hotel Sacher to a mountain of gambling debts that were a constant burning humiliation for his uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph. He was the black sheep, the lost cause, the rebel without a purpose. But even for a man as seemingly untouchable as Otto, there was one duty from which he could not run. It was the single, non-negotiable command of the dynasty. He had to marry. He had to produce a legitimate heir. In the cold, pragmatic calculus of imperial survival, Otto's personal life was irrelevant. His bloodline was everything. And so the search began for a woman who could not only tolerate the Playboy prince, but who could perhaps redeem him, or failing that, at least produce a son and endure. The choice fell upon Princess Maria Josepha of Saxony. If you were to sit down and design a human being to be the absolute, complete antithesis of Archduke Otto, you would create Maria Josepha. Born on May 31st, 1867, she was a member of the House of Wettin, the daughter of King George of Saxony. The Saxon court in Dresden was, if anything, even more rigidly Catholic and conservative than the Habsburg court in Vienna. Her upbringing was a sheltered cocoon of prayer, duty, and quiet modesty. She was not a fiery beauty, a sparkling intellectual, or a rebellious spirit. She was, by all accounts, gentle, unassuming, deeply kind, and possessed of a profound, unshakable religious faith. She was the very embodiment of Kaisertreue, loyalty to the emperor and to God. For the Habsburgs, and especially for Emperor Franz Joseph, she was the perfect candidate. She wasn't just a bride, she was an antidote. She was the holy water intended to exorcise Otto's demons. The quiet, stabilizing anchor they desperately hoped to tie to their most wayward, sinking ship. One can only imagine the thoughts of this deeply pious 19-year-old girl upon learning her fate. She was to be handed over to the most notorious playboy in Europe, a man whose scandalous affairs were whispered about in every court from St. Petersburg to London, a man known for his drunkenness, his debts, and his utter contempt for the piety she held so dear. For Maria Josepha, this was not a fairy tale romance. It was, in all likelihood, a terrifying martyrdom, a sacrifice she was commanded to make for God and her royal house. The wedding took place on October 2nd, 1886, in Dresden. It was, of course, a magnificent state affair, filled with all the pomp and pageantry befitting a union between two of the continent's oldest Catholic dynasties. The 20-year-old Otto, impossibly handsome and charismatic, stood at the altar playing the part of the dutiful prince. Beside him stood Maria Josepha, demure and modest. The world watched, and the whispers were deafening. How long will this last? How will she ever tame him? It was seen less as a marriage and more as a desperate gamble. They settled in Vienna, often at the beautiful Augarten Palace. And for Maria Josepha, the grim reality of her new life must have set in almost immediately. The gamble had failed. The Playboy prince had not been reformed. He had not been tamed. In fact, he didn't even seem to slow down. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry before Otto returned to his old ways. He resumed his nights in the cabarets, his high-stakes gambling, and, most cruelly, his relationships with his mistresses. This wasn't a case of discreet infidelity, which tragically might have been an expected part of her life. This was the same loud, public, flaunted debauchery he had engaged in as a bachelor. He continued his affair with Louise Robinson and others, making absolutely no effort to hide his transgressions. This was a humiliation of unimaginable depth for his young wife. Imagine being a 19-year-old in a foreign court, your husband's scandalous behavior the talk of the town. The servants in your own palace would whisper. The other archduchesses, while perhaps outwardly polite, would watch you with a clinical, pitying gaze. Every time your husband returned home in the early hours of the morning, smelling of perfume and champagne, or every time he didn't return at all, it was a public declaration that she, his wife, was nothing more than a dynastic broodmare, a formal obligation he had fulfilled at the altar and could now safely ignore. But Maria Josepha, in her quiet, unassuming way, was far from weak. She did not break. She did not create scandals of her own. She did not flee. She endured. She built a fortress around herself, a world within a world, founded on the two things her husband could not touch, her faith and her children. And in the one area that truly mattered to the dynasty, the marriage was an astonishing success. On August 17, 1887, less than a year after their wedding, Maria Josepha gave birth to a son, Archduke Karl. The birth of a healthy son was a monumental victory. A direct male heir had been born into the correct line of succession. Remember, at this time, the heir to the throne, Otto's brother Franz Ferdinand, was still unmarried and was already causing a constitutional crisis with his own unsuitable relationship with Countess Sophie Chotek. The birth of Karl, therefore, was a massive relief to Emperor Franz Joseph. Maria Josepha had done it. She had performed her sacred duty flawlessly. She had secured the future of the dynasty. In 1895, she would do it again, giving birth to a second son, Archduke Maximilian Eugen. She had provided an heir and a spare. This success transformed Maria Josepha's status at court. She was no longer just the poor wife of the scandalous Otto. She was the mother of the future. She had proven her worth in the only currency the dynasty truly valued, and she earned the profound, unwavering respect of the one man who mattered most, Emperor Franz Joseph. The emperor, who held Otto in such open and weary contempt, held Maria Josepha in the highest possible regard. He saw in her the absolute ideal of a Habsburg consort. She was pious, she was dignified, she was fertile, and crucially, she bore her immense cross, her husband, with silent, stoic grace. She never complained. She never caused a scandal. She simply prayed, raised her sons, and did her charitable work. She was, in his eyes, a living saint, and he afforded her a level of respect and protection that was ironclad. This protection gave her a unique power. In the rigid world of the Habsburg court, she was untouchable. She was the emperor's suffering saint, and her quiet dignity was a constant glaring rebuke to her husband's noisy, chaotic life. She poured every ounce of her being into her sons. Her life's mission, it seemed, was to ensure that they grew up to be everything their father was not. She raised them with a profound sense of Catholic piety, a deep understanding of duty, and a genuine kindness. She shielded them as much as possible from their father's chaotic influence. While Otto was out carousing, Maria Josepha was in the nursery, reading to her boys, teaching them their prayers, and molding the character of the man who would one day be Karl I, the last emperor of Austria-Hungary. And so for nearly 2 decades, this was the bizarre, tragic arrangement at the heart of the Augarten Palace. It was a house split in two. On one side, Archduke Otto, continuing his downward spiral of drink, debt, and debauchery. And on the other, Archduchess Maria Josepha, the Queen of Sorrows, quietly and methodically raising the next generation, her world revolving around the chapel and the nursery. He was a public explosion of ID. She was a quiet, powerful force of stability and superego. But Otto's lifestyle was not just a moral failing. It was a physical one. And the diseases of his debauchery were not just a metaphor. He had contracted syphilis. It was the ultimate violation. The sickness of the brothels had entered his home, a direct threat to his pious wife. For a woman like Maria Josepha, the physical and spiritual revulsion must have been unimaginable. It was the physical manifestation of his sin, a disease that would ultimately and gruesomely consume him. But not everyone abandoned him. In an act of almost superhuman Christian charity, Maria Josepha, the wife he had publicly humiliated for 20 years, the woman he had infected with his lifestyle, if not his disease, would come to his sick bed. Driven by her profound sense of marital duty and an unshakable belief in Catholic forgiveness, she would visit the man who had destroyed her personal happiness. Some accounts even state she helped to nurse this ravaged, dying shell of a man. It was the final tragic act in their shared life. The sinner, broken and repellent, and the saint, fulfilling her vows to the very bitterest of ends. This quiet, unbelievable strength defines Maria Josepha. She had been given an impossible task, to marry a man who was a force of pure chaos. She could not save him, but she did save his lineage, and in the end, she offered him a grace he had never offered her. But the consequences of Otto's life were far from over. His body was failing, and the Playboy prince was about to pay the ultimate price for his decades of excess. The final chapter of his life would be as scandalous as his living it, a slow, agonizing decline that the empire would try and fail to hide. Join us next time for the final tragic decline and death of Archduke Otto and explore the complex, world-changing legacy he left behind. A legacy that would be carried by the son he barely knew into the inferno of the First World War. After fulfilling his dynastic duty by fathering 2 sons, Otto sank even deeper into his ruin. Having provided his heir and a spare, Otto felt liberated to plunge even deeper into the debauchery that defined him. He was a man living a life of pure, unadulterated sensation, a chaotic force of nature who had shattered every rule of the Habsburg court. But there is a natural law that even an archduke cannot defy. A body, even a royal one, can only endure so much. The Playboy prince, the Habsburg Don Juan, was about to discover that every transgression has its price, and his bill was coming due in the most horrific way imaginable. In the smoke-filled, gas-lit underworld of Vienna's brothels and backstage dressing rooms, a silent, invisible executioner was waiting. Otto, in his relentless pursuit of pleasure, had contracted syphilis. In the 21st century, the word is an afterthought, an affliction cured with a simple course of penicillin. But in the early 1900s, it was a terrifying, protracted death sentence. There was no cure. There was no effective treatment. It was a disease of profound, unspeakable shame, whispered as the French disease or the Great Pox, and seen by the moralists of the day as the direct, physical wage of sin. For a man like Otto, it was the ultimate devastating irony. The body he had used for his greatest pleasures would now become the source of his greatest and final torment. For years, the disease likely lay dormant, a ticking time bomb within his blood. But by the early 1900s, as he entered his late 30s, the bomb detonated. The illness entered its terrifying tertiary stage. This was no longer a simple treatable rash. This was a systemic invasion. The spirochetes began their final brutal assault on his body, his bones, and his mind. He began to suffer from intense agonizing pains in his legs and joints, the classic lightning pains of tabes dorsalis, a neurological degeneration that made walking an excruciating, clumsy ordeal. The man who had once been the picture of athletic, charismatic grace, the dashing officer who could dance all night, was now a hobbled, pained invalid. But the most devastating and most symbolically grotesque symptom was the one that attacked his very identity. Tertiary syphilis often attacks cartilage, and in Otto's case it allegedly began to destroy the structure of his face. The famous Habsburg chin was a mark of his lineage, but his new affliction was a mark of his lifestyle. The man whose handsome, charming face had adorned newspapers and captivated women was, quite literally, beginning to decay while he was still alive. His physical decomposition became a living metaphor for the moral decay the court had always accused him of. Now the great Habsburg machine of secrecy, which had spent decades covering up his scandals, lurched into its final, most desperate operation. This was no longer about hiding an affair or a gambling debt. This was about hiding the man himself. The Playboy prince had to vanish. He was quietly removed from his grand residence at the Augarten Palace and shuttled away, first to private sanatoriums in Egypt, hoping the dry air might offer some relief, and later to a private villa in the Döbling or Währing district of Vienna. He was now a state secret, an inconvenient, dying horror story. The court, and perhaps even the emperor, could not bear to look at what he had become. He was a living, breathing, rotting testament to the failure of their bloodline, the dark secret hidden away in the attic of the empire. There is one anecdote, a story so visceral and so perfectly tragically Otto, that it has survived as the final horrifying legend of his life. By this point, his health was shattered, his face allegedly disfigured. Yet the ghost of the man he once was, the aristocratic sportsman, still flickered. He was invited to attend an imperial hunt, one of the last great rituals of the Habsburg nobility. He was likely desperate for a semblance of his old life, a moment to feel like an archduke again. He arrived at the hunt, but he was not the dashing figure of old. He was a broken man, bundled against the cold, and to hide the ravages of his illness he was reportedly wearing a prosthetic, a leather device Some accounts say a custom-made nosepiece, fashioned by a specialist to create the illusion of a face, a mask to hide the decay beneath. He was, in the most literal sense, a facade. As he rode, the movement and exertion were too much. The prosthetic, this final desperate mask of nobility, slipped and fell to the ground in front of the assembled party. The naked Archduke incident at the Sacher Hotel had been a scandal of brazen defiance. This was a scandal of pure, unmitigated horror. It was the final grotesque unmasking. The man who had flaunted his body in hedonistic glory was now revealed as a decaying ruin. The shock, the pity, the revulsion. It was the end of his public life. He was never seen in polite society again. He retreated or was forced into his villa, a prisoner of his own decaying body to await the end. And it is here, in this final dark chapter, that the story takes its most profound and unexpected turn. His old life was gone, his fair-weather friends, his drinking companions, the actresses and dancers who had flocked to his side when he was charming and generous, they were nowhere to be found. Who would dare to venture into the sick room of a man dying of syphilis? The risk, the stigma, the sheer horror of his physical state was too much. The court, his peers, his family, they had written him off. He was alone, abandoned, left to rot in his self-made hell. Not quite alone. One person came, one person stayed. One person who had every reason in the world to let him die alone, to turn her back on him as he had turned his back on her for 2 decades, his wife, Maria Josepha. This is the story's ultimate poignant irony. The woman whose piety he had mocked, whose life he had humiliated, whose world he had actively tried to defile, now became his sole comfort and his only nurse. But this was not an act of romantic love, not a Hollywood reconciliation. It's doubtful she had ever loved him. This was something deeper, something almost superhuman. This was the ultimate expression of her unshakable Catholic faith. Her entire life, Maria Josepha had been taught that her duty was to God and her family. She had prayed for her husband's soul for 20 years. Now, in his final agonizing days, her prayer became action. She did not see the Playboy prince. She did not see the man who had betrayed her. She saw a suffering, lost soul, a human being in his final extremity, a sinner on the threshold of eternity, and her duty was to save that soul. She moved into the villa with him. She sat by his bedside. She endured the sights and smells of his horrific illness, the physical decay that must have been terrifying. She read prayers to him. She brought a priest, his confessor, to his side. She held his hand when the pain became unbearable. She, who he had treated as nothing, became his everything. She faced his death with the same profound stoic dignity with which she had faced his life. She was no longer just the long-suffering wife. She was a figure of almost terrifying moral strength, a living saint in a sinner's hell. The end came slowly. By late October 1906, he was slipping in and out of consciousness. The pain was likely managed with morphine, the final anesthetic for a life lived at a scream. He was only 41 years old, but he was a man of 80, his body completely ravaged. On November 1st, 1906, on the Feast of All Saints, the Habsburg Don Juan, the greatest sinner of the dynasty, finally died. The irony was complete. He died in his private villa, with only his pious wife and his confessor at his side, on the very day the Church celebrates its holiest figures. The official cause of death released by the Imperial Court was a masterpiece of euphemism. It was attributed to a long-standing illness, or in some reports a severe inflammation of the throat. The word syphilis was never, ever spoken. The final lie, the final facade was put in place. The imperial machine had its last word. The reaction to his death was a quiet, collective sigh of relief. The court was relieved. The constant source of scandal, the walking, talking, and finally dying embarrassment, was gone. Emperor Franz Joseph, ever the Stoic, performed his public duties, attending the funeral of the nephew who had caused him so much pain. His private thoughts we will never know. Perhaps there was relief, but also a deep, tragic sadness for the bright, charismatic boy who had been lost so long ago. For the public, it was the end of a legend. The cabarets had lost their favorite subject. The gossip columnists had lost their best material. But for those who had known his charisma, there was a real sadness. He was, in his own twisted way, a beloved figure, a flash of vibrant, dangerous color in a gray, formal world. They mourned the idea of him, the rebellious spirit he represented. Archduke Otto was dead. The Playboy prince was buried in the Imperial crypt in Vienna, his lead sarcophagus placed among the saints and emperors he had spent his life defying. The man was gone. His body was sealed away. But his story, his impact was just beginning. The consequences of his wild, chaotic life and his tragic, shameful death would ripple forward, shaping the character of his son, the man who was now one step closer to the throne. The scandals Otto created would not be buried with him. They would fester, weakening the monarchy's image at the most critical moment in its history, just as the guns of August 1914 were preparing to fire. Join us for the final part of our story as we explore the profound legacy of Archduke Otto. We will examine his impact on his son, the last emperor of Austria, and ask the final question: how did the Playboy prince and his scandals contribute to the final catastrophic collapse of the 600-year-old Habsburg dynasty? On November 1st, 1906, Archduke Otto's life had ended. His body, ravaged by syphilis, was sealed in a sarcophagus in the Imperial crypt. The Playboy prince was finally silent, but his consequences were just being born. For the Imperial court, the funeral was a performance of closing a book. The official, polite obituaries were written. The official, polite mourning was observed. But beneath this thin veneer of protocol, the overwhelming, unspoken emotion was relief. The problem was solved. The embarrassment was over. The man who had been a financial black hole and a public relations nightmare was gone. The dynasty, they believed, could now move on, its dignity bruised but intact. They were wrong. They had buried a body, but they had not buried the scandal. The shame Otto had unleashed upon the Habsburg name was a kind of contagion, a poison that had already seeped into the foundations of the monarchy. His death didn't cleanse the wound, it merely stopped the bleeding. The infection was already spreading, and its consequences would be more profound and more devastating than anyone in that funeral procession could have possibly imagined. Otto's true legacy was not one of his own actions, but of the powerful polar opposite reactions he inspired. What does a son do when his father is a monster? What does a boy do when his name is synonymous with the shame of an empire? He becomes the opposite. The single most important, most tangible, and most historically significant legacy of Archduke Otto's life was his son, Archduke Karl. Karl, who was 19 when his father died, was not his father's son in any way but biological. He was the masterpiece, the grand project of his mother, Maria Josepha. For 2 decades, Maria Josepha had endured a public, agonizing martyrdom. She had watched her husband cavort with actresses, heard the whispers of the naked Archduke, and finally nursed him through the grotesque decay of his final illness. She had channeled all of that pain, all of her piety, and all of her iron-willed sense of duty into one singular goal: to forge a son who would be the antidote to his father. And in this, she was terrifyingly successful. She created the anti-Otto. Let us look at the man she built. Where Otto was loud, brash, and charismatic, Karl was quiet, introspective, and almost painfully shy. Where Otto was a notorious serial womanizer, Karl was deeply moral and famously devoted to one woman. His marriage in 1911 to Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma was not a cold, dynastic arrangement like his parents'. It was a genuine, passionate love match, a partnership of equals that produced 8 children. On the night of their wedding, he reportedly told his new wife, "Now we must lead each other to heaven." It was a sentiment so pure, so profoundly unlike his father, that it almost seems to belong to another century. Where Otto was defiantly secular, if not openly profane, Karl was imbued with a piety so deep it bordered on mysticism. His mother had taken him on pilgrimages, drilled him in the catechism, and instilled in him a belief that his life was a sacred, divine duty. He was, in a very real sense, a monk in a soldier's uniform. Where Otto shirked every responsibility, Karl embraced it. He was a dutiful soldier, a loving father, and a man who genuinely believed his sole purpose was to serve God and his people. This was the man who, by 1906, was second in line to the throne, right behind his uncle, Franz Ferdinand. The dynasty looked at Karl, and finally, they breathed a sigh of relief. The Otto problem had been solved. The line was now secure with a man who was, if anything, too good, too pious, too decent. But history, with its cruel sense of irony, was preparing a test for Karl that his manufactured virtue was uniquely unsuited to pass. His father's sins had set the stage, and Karl, the anti-Otto, would be the one to pay the price. While Karl was being forged in the fires of his mother's piety, the empire itself was rotting from within. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1900s was a magnificent anachronistic relic. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual colossus held together by one fragile thread, the myth of the Habsburg dynasty. The people, the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Poles, the Croats, the Bosnians, didn't necessarily love Austria. They had a centuries-old, almost religious fealty to the figure of the emperor, to the House of Habsburg. It was a brand, a symbol of stability and tradition that transcended politics. Archduke Otto's entire life was a direct public assault on that brand. He wasn't just a personal embarrassment, he was a political liability. In an age of rising socialism, nationalism, and republicanism, the monarchy's critics were gathering ammunition. They painted the aristocracy as decadent, parasitic, and morally bankrupt. And Archduke Otto, the Habsburg Don Juan, the naked archduke who burned through public funds, was their poster boy. He wasn't an exception. He was proof. He confirmed every dark suspicion the public held about their out-of-touch rulers. Otto's scandals also served to radicalize his own brother, the heir, Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand, who already despised the Viennese court, saw his brother as the ultimate symbol of its rot. It likely deepened his resolve to create his own court and to defy the establishment in his own way, not with debauchery, but with his scandalous morganatic marriage to a mere countess, Sophie Chotek. The dysfunction of the brothers, one a degenerate playboy, the other a stubborn, angry reformer, presented a fractured, weakened front to the world. The image of Habsburg unity was shattered, and then the match was lit. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Otto's brother, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. The shots that echoed around the world killed the heir to the throne and ignited the First World War. And in that single violent moment, the anti-Otto, the pious, gentle, and inexperienced Archduke Karl, became the heir apparent to the entire vast, crumbling empire, which was now plunging into the most catastrophic war in human history. In 1916, after a 68-year reign, the old emperor Franz Joseph died. The anchor of the empire was gone. And so in the dead of winter, in the middle of a losing war, Otto's son was crowned as Emperor Karl I, the last emperor of Austria. The ultimate tragic irony was now complete. The son of the man who had done more than any other to shame the monarchy was now solely responsible for saving it. And the very virtues his mother had so carefully instilled in him, the very qualities that made him the anti-Otto, now made him a profoundly ineffective wartime leader. He was a man of peace in a world that demanded blood. He was a man of honesty in a game that required deceit. He genuinely loved his people and was horrified by the slaughter. He secretly tried to negotiate a separate peace with France in what became known as the Sixtus Affair. When the secret was revealed, his allies in Germany were furious, calling him a traitor. His own people saw him as weak and naive. He was a decent man, perhaps the most decent Habsburg to ever sit on the throne. But he was given an impossible hand, a hand dealt to him in part by his father. The empire he inherited was already hollowed out. The public's faith, corroded by years of scandals like Otto's, was gone. The war destroyed what little was left. The people weren't just tired of war, they were tired of the monarchy. It no longer seemed sacred. It seemed, as Otto had proven, all too flawed and human. In November 1918, the war was lost. The empire shattered into a dozen new countries. Emperor Karl I, the anti-Otto, was forced to renounce participation in state affairs. He was forced into exile, the last ruler of a dynasty that had lasted for over 600 years. He died just a few years later, in 1922, of pneumonia on the island of Madeira, in poverty. He was only 34 years old. So who was Archduke Otto of Austria? Was he just a comical footnote, a royal playboy who drank and whored his way to an early grave? Or was he something more? Otto's life in the grand sweep of history was not a direct cause. He did not start the war. He did not sign the treaty that dismembered his homeland. But he was a profound and powerful symptom of the disease that afflicted the empire. His scandals eroded public trust and provided ammunition for the monarchy's critics, contributing to the hollowing out of the foundations and making the final collapse, driven by war and nationalism, perhaps more inevitable. He was a man born into a role he never wanted and was utterly unsuited for, a life of pure, crushing duty. And in his desperate, selfish, and deeply human rebellion against that duty, he provided the perfect ammunition for his family's enemies. He lived his life as a public performance of hedonism, and in doing so, he helped strip the monarchy of its last best defense, its aura of divine, untouchable majesty. The Playboy prince who shamed the empire did more than just shame his family. His actions damaged the very idea of monarchy in the public eye, weakening its legitimacy at the precise moment it needed all the respect it could get to face the coming storms. He did not live to see the world he had helped to break. He never saw his pious son, the anti-Otto, take the throne, nor did he see that son lose it all. But in a tragic, undeniable way, the father's sins and the son's virtues were the two final interlocking pieces in the fall of the House of Habsburg.